With our Tekno SCT410SL truck now taking shape, it's time to finish up on the chassis with its various mounting brackets for electronics. Although before we do that, we need to get through the next two bags, K and L, front and rear shock assembly. So bag K contains the front shock kit, lots of small parts in this, so take care to empty its contents, making sure nothing is left behind in the bag. The shocks are basically the same as those from the EB410, with only very minor differences. You'll need some thread lock as well as some O-ring grease for this bag, so with those to hand, let's get started. With the main shock body in hand, place the black rubber O-ring around the top threads, making sure it seats nicely down into the groove. Next, we can reach for our Delrin pieces, which all need to be greased. So drop in a shock X-ring, followed by a small Delrin washer, another shock X-ring, and top off with a hat washer with the raised piece facing upwards. Before screwing down the cap, just so it's snug holding everything in place. Don't over tighten just yet, as we want to get the shock shaft through first. Talking of the shock shaft, we need to attach our shock piston, so drop it into place on the top of the shock shaft, not the threaded end, making sure the writing on the piston faces upwards, after which we can insert a 5mm piston screw, bearing in mind it's metal into metal here, so apply some thread lock and tighten into place. Before inserting into the shock body, apply some grease to the threads to prevent it from tearing any O-rings, before pushing through the body, and then wiping off any excess grease once through, making sure the shock shaft is nice and smooth. Next, we drop on a shock boot, after which we proceed to install the rod end. You want to make sure the rod end goes on the same amount with both shocks, 27mm to be exact, so with it in place, pop a pivot ball through the rod end, and make sure the ball moves freely. Finally, we can install the shock collar by screwing it onto the shock body, and with that, the first shock is complete. Repeat the exact same process with the remaining parts from the bag in order to construct the second shock. So with the 400 CST bottle handy, we go ahead and proceed to fill the shock with oil. After which we pump the shock shaft from bottom to top around 5 times. Now we can prepare the cap by inserting an O-ring so it sits far inside the cap. And I also like to add a few drops of oil into the shock cap here, after which we can proceed to installing the cap onto the filled shock. At this point, proceed to install the tiny O-ring to the bleed screw, using some oil helps to avoid tearing the O-ring here, before going back to the shock, holding it at a 45-degree angle with the bleed hole facing upwards. Press the shock shaft so it's all the way to the top, wiping away any excess oil, and while holding, insert the bleed screw into the cap until snug. Next, we need to pump the shock shaft up and down vigorously around 20 times or so in order to emulsify the oil, after which the shaft can be fully extended and the bleed screw removed, again facing upwards at an angle, and push the shaft all the way up again, wiping any excess oil if need be, and finally tighten down the bleed screw until snug. And that's it, first shock fully prepared. After replicating the same process on the other shock, we have both front shocks complete. All that's left is to insert into the supplied springs, and insert a spring perch on the opposite end to hold it in place, with an 8mm set screw to secure. Finally, insert a shock cap bushing into the shock cap, and we're ready to mount to the vehicle. When mounting the shocks to the buggy, note that the slot in the spring perch should face the outside of the vehicle. So with that in mind, slide the shock cap onto the shock standoff, and screw on a flanged lock nut to secure into place. The bottom of the shock is secured to the suspension arm, the inside hole being the stock position, with a single 18mm shock mount screw securing it into place. Note that the black screw is right-hand threaded and goes in on the left side of the vehicle. Repeat on the opposite side, so lock nut up on the shock standoff, and 18mm shock mount screw on the lower inside hole, this one being silver and left-hand threaded. And with that, our front shocks are complete. The rear shocks in bag L are slightly different to the front, so it's a good idea to build a set at a time rather than get them mixed up. The shock body is longer and the piston is slightly thicker, but otherwise the process in building them is exactly the same. Note that with the rear shocks, the rod end should be installed, leaving a 37mm gap between the rod end and the shock body. Again, we mount these onto the shock standoffs with a single nut, taking care to make sure the slot in the spring perch is facing upwards, and again using the black screw on the left side and the silver screw on the right side of the truck. And we are done. That's bag K and L complete, and both front and rear shocks mounted onto the vehicle. All feels perfectly fluid, and that's pretty much all the main parts of the vehicle built and complete now, and it's looking great so far. In the next part, we move on to bag M, installing some extra parts onto the main chassis, ready for electronics.